The 911 call came at 9:47 p.m. "There's a man stealing from our restaurant safe." The manager's voice trembled with righteous certainty. But what Tessa Monroe didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the exhausted man in the worn denim jacket wasn't a thief. He was Evan Cole, the owner of Harbor Street Bistro, a single father who'd lost everything and rebuilt from nothing. In 60 seconds, police would arrive. In 5 minutes, handcuffs would click around his wrists while his 7-year-old son watched through fogged glass. And in one devastating moment, the truth would shatter everything Tessa thought she knew about power, judgment, and what it really means to lead. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this journey travels. The kitchen of Harbor Street Bistro had always possessed a particular kind of music. The rhythmic clatter of pans against stainless steel, the hiss of oil meeting heat, the steady percussion of knife blades against worn cutting boards. But tonight, that familiar symphony had been replaced by something far more sinister, the crackling static of a police radio and the heavy silence of accusation. Tessa Monroe stood near the restaurant's back office, her smartphone still pressed against her ear, her free hand trembling slightly as she pointed toward the man by the industrial sink. She was 32, sharp-featured, with auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to pull her entire face into an expression of perpetual disapproval. She'd been hired exactly 3 weeks ago as Harbor Street Bistro's new general manager, brought in by the ownership group, or so she believed, to turn things around, to bring efficiency and accountability to what she'd been told was a struggling operation plagued by loose management and declining profits. "Yes, officer, he's still here," Tessa said into her phone, her voice carrying that peculiar mixture of fear and vindication that comes when someone believes they've caught wrongdoing red-handed. "He was standing right by the open safe. I saw cash in his jacket pocket. No, he hasn't tried to run. Please hurry." The man she was reporting, Evan Cole, stood perfectly still beside the 3-compartment sink, his hands dripping soapy water onto the rubber mat beneath his feet. He was 38 but looked older, with the kind of exhaustion that had settled into the lines around his eyes and the set of his shoulders. His dark hair was flecked with premature gray, and his worn denim jacket hung open over a faded t-shirt that had once been black but had faded to charcoal through countless washings. His hands, Tessa had noted with satisfaction, were calloused and stained, the hands of someone who worked with them, someone who cleaned and scrubbed and did the jobs that people like her didn't have to think about. What Tessa didn't see, what she had trained herself not to see in her relentless pursuit of efficiency and order, was the way every other person in that kitchen had gone absolutely still. Not the stillness of guilt, but something else. Something closer to grief. Miguel, the sous chef who'd worked at Harbor Street for 6 years, had set down his knife so carefully that it didn't make a sound against the cutting board. His dark eyes fixed on Evan with an expression of such profound sadness that it would have told anyone paying attention that something was deeply, terribly wrong with this picture. Carolyn, the head waitress who'd been with the restaurant since it opened 9 years ago, stood frozen in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, one hand pressed over her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears she was desperately trying to hold back. Even young Marcus, the prep cook who'd only been there 8 months, understood enough to know that what was happening was a catastrophe. He'd moved to stand beside Miguel, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw clenched tight. But Tessa saw none of this, or perhaps more accurately, she saw it and interpreted it through the lens of her own certainty. To her, their silence was complicity. Their grief was guilt. She'd read about this in her management textbooks, how employees would band together to protect one of their own, even when that person was clearly in the wrong. How the culture of a workplace could become so toxic that theft and dishonesty were normalized, protected, even celebrated. She'd been warned about this place after all. The corporate consultant who'd recommended her for the position had told her that Harbor Street Bistro was old-fashioned, that it operated on outdated models of loyalty over productivity, that the previous owner had let sentiment cloud business judgment. Her job, she'd been told, was to modernize, to create systems, to replace feelings with facts. And here, finally, was her proof. Here was the validation of everything she'd suspected in her first 3 weeks. The way the staff seemed to move around her rather than with her. The subtle resistance to her new scheduling systems. The quiet conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She'd known something was wrong, and now she'd caught it. The safe in the back office had been left open. She'd discovered it 15 minutes ago while doing her nightly walkthrough, and her heart had seized with a mixture of alarm and, yes, excitement. Finally, evidence. Finally, something concrete. And there, just outside the office, had been Evan, the dishwasher, the quiet man who came in for the evening shift, who kept his head down and his mouth shut, who seemed to appear out of nowhere about 4 months ago asking for work. She'd noticed something in his jacket pocket as he turned. The corner of bills, cash, protruding just enough to be visible. Tessa hadn't hesitated. She'd confronted him immediately, her voice sharp and authoritative. "What were you doing near the office?" Evan had looked at her with those exhausted eyes and said simply, "Closing the safe." "The safe that was already open?" Tessa's voice had risen. "The safe that you just happened to be standing next to? With cash in your pocket?" "Tessa," Evan had said quietly, "if you'll just let me—" "Don't." She'd held up one hand, her voice like ice. "Don't insult my intelligence by trying to explain this away. I know exactly what I saw." And that's when she'd walked to the kitchen, pulled out her phone, and called 911. Now, as the police sirens grew closer outside, Tessa felt a surge of something that felt almost like triumph. This was what good management looked like. This was accountability. This was what happened when you didn't let sentiment cloud your judgment, when you followed the evidence, when you did the hard thing instead of the easy thing. The sirens stopped outside. Red and blue lights began to paint the walls of the kitchen in alternating colors, turning everything into a surreal tableau. "They're here," Tessa announced unnecessarily, her voice cutting through the terrible silence. That's when the back door burst open, and everything began to fall apart in ways Tessa couldn't possibly have anticipated. The child came in first. He was small, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair that stuck up in the back and eyes that were too large and too frightened for his thin face. He wore a puffy winter coat that was slightly too big for him and sneakers that lit up with each frantic step. He'd been waiting in Evan's car in the parking lot, watching through the fogged windows, and when he'd seen the police arrive, he'd panicked. "Dad!" The boy's voice cracked with terror as he ran into the kitchen. "Dad, what's happening?" Evan moved then, for the first time since Tessa had made her accusation. He turned toward his son, and something in his expression shifted, a kind of protective gentleness that transformed his entire face. "Liam." Evan's voice was soft, controlled, even as his son crashed into him, small arms wrapping around his waist. "Liam, buddy, what did I tell you about staying in the car?" "But the police came." Liam's voice was muffled against his father's stomach, thick with tears. "They came for you. They came and I thought... Evan's soapy hands came to rest on his son's back, leaving wet patches on the puffy coat. "Nothing's going to happen. It's just a misunderstanding." 2 police officers entered behind Liam, their presence filling the kitchen with an authority that made even the physical space seem smaller. The first was a woman in her 40s with sergeant stripes on her sleeve and eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. The second was younger, maybe 30, with the kind of rigid posture that suggested he was still trying to prove something. "Harbor Street Bistro?" the female sergeant asked, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the frozen staff, the frightened child, the soaking wet man, and Tessa, who stood straighter, trying to project competence. "Yes. I'm Tessa Monroe, the general manager." Tessa stepped forward, her voice clipped and professional. "I'm the one who called. This man," she gestured toward Evan, "was caught stealing from the restaurant safe. He has cash in his jacket pocket that doesn't belong to him." The sergeant's eyes moved to Evan, who was still holding his son, his expression carefully neutral. "Sir," the sergeant said, her voice measured, "I'm going to need you to let go of the child and keep your hands where I can see them." This was the moment that should have felt like victory for Tessa. This was vindication, justice, the proper consequence for theft. But something in the room had changed. The air had become so thick with tension that it felt hard to breathe. And Tessa, for the first time, felt the first whisper of doubt. Not in what she'd seen, but in something else. Something she couldn't quite name. "No!" Liam's voice rose to a shriek. He didn't do anything! My dad didn't do anything wrong! Liam? Evan's voice remained impossibly calm as he gently tried to unwrap his son's arms from around him. Liam, I need you to let go now. Can you go stand by Miguel? Miguel, can you… Of course. Miguel moved forward immediately, his voice thick with emotion. Come here, mijo. Come stand with me. But Liam wouldn't let go. His small fingers clutched at his father's wet shirt, his whole body trembling. The younger officer moved forward, his hand near his belt, and that's when Carolyn finally found her voice. Wait. She stepped into the kitchen fully, her hands raised in a gesture of peace, her voice shaking. Wait, please. This is all wrong. You don't understand. He's not… Ma'am, I need you to step back, the sergeant said firmly. But he's not a thief. Carolyn's voice broke. He's… Carolyn! Evan's voice cut through gently but firmly. Don't. The single word silenced her, and Tessa felt another flicker of something she didn't want to examine too closely. Why would the dishwasher be giving orders to the head waitress? Why would she listen? Sir, the sergeant said again, moving closer to Evan, I need you to separate from the child now. We just need to have a conversation, but I can't do that with you holding him. Evan looked down at his son, at Liam's tear-streaked face, and something passed between them, some silent communication that only fathers and sons understand. Then Evan did something that Tessa would remember for the rest of her life. He knelt down, lowering himself to Liam's eye level despite the police presence, despite the accusation, despite everything. Liam, he said softly, his hands coming to rest on his son's shoulders, remember what we talked about? About being brave? Liam nodded, hiccuping. I need you to be brave right now, okay? I need you to go with Miguel, and I need you to trust me that everything's going to be fine. But Dad, trust me. Evan's voice was so gentle, so full of love and certainty, that even Tessa felt something shift in her chest. Have I ever broken a promise to you? Liam shook his head, tears streaming down his cheeks. Then trust me now. Go with Miguel. It took another moment, but finally Liam let go. Miguel immediately stepped forward and scooped the boy up, despite the fact that Liam was probably too old to be carried. He held him close, murmuring something in Spanish that Tessa couldn't understand but that seemed to calm the child slightly. Evan stood up slowly, his hands raised to shoulder height, his jacket falling open to reveal the pocket where Tessa had seen the cash. The bills were still visible, rolled up and protruding slightly. Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands on the sink, the sergeant said, moving behind Evan. Evan complied without a word, his expression unchanging. Tessa watched as the younger officer approached Evan from the side, his hand reaching toward the pocket of Evan's jacket. This was it. This was the moment of proof. The officer withdrew the roll of bills and held it up. Approximately $200, he said to the sergeant. Sir, the sergeant addressed Evan while maintaining her position behind him. Where did you get this money? From the safe in the office, Evan said calmly. It's money I withdrew for my son's school field trip tomorrow. Tessa's voice cut across the kitchen like a blade. The safe he had no authorization to access. The safe that was left open because he'd just stolen from it. Is that true, sir? The sergeant asked Evan. Did you open the safe? Yes, Evan said simply. There it was. Confession. Tessa felt her spine straighten, her certainty returning. And do you have authorization to access the restaurant's safe? The sergeant continued. Evan was quiet for a moment, and in that pause, something strange happened. Every member of the staff seemed to hold their breath, all of them looking at Evan with expressions that Tessa still couldn't interpret. It was as if they were waiting for him to say something, to do something, to reveal something that would change everything. But Evan just said, I do. That's a lie, Tessa interjected immediately. I'm the general manager, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that no dishwasher has authorization to access the restaurant's safe. That would be absurd. The sergeant turned to look at Tessa fully for the first time, and there was something in her expression, a kind of weariness, that Tessa didn't understand. Ma'am, do you have documentation showing who has authorization to access the safe? Tessa faltered for just a moment. I have a list of management personnel. Obviously, dishwashers aren't included. Could I see that list, please? Tessa felt the first real stirring of uncertainty. She hadn't actually looked at the safe authorization list. She'd been given it during her first week, along with approximately 50 other documents about operations, vendors, insurance policies, payroll procedures. She'd filed it away, assuming it was standard, assuming it contained exactly what she expected. "It's in my office," she said, her voice slightly less certain. "But I can tell you what's on it. Management only. That's standard protocol for any restaurant." "Nevertheless," the sergeant said with the patience of someone who had heard every variation of assumption masquerading as fact, "I'd like to see it." Tessa hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Fine. I'll get it." She walked to the back office, the office she'd commandeered 3 weeks ago, the office that still contained filing cabinets full of documents she hadn't fully reviewed, and began searching through the organized chaos for the safe authorization list. Behind her, in the kitchen, the tableau remained frozen. Evan still stood facing the sink, his hands braced against the stainless steel. The younger officer stood nearby, the roll of cash still in his hand. Miguel held Liam, who had buried his face in the sous chef's shoulder. Carolyn stood with one hand pressed against the doorframe, tears running silently down her face. Marcus remained by the prep station, his fists clenched. And in the parking lot, unnoticed by anyone, a sleek black sedan pulled up. A man in an expensive suit got out, checked his phone, and began walking toward the restaurant's back entrance with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly why he was there. Inside the office, Tessa found the folder labeled Security and Access Protocols. She flipped it open, scanning through pages of forms and documentation, her finger running down lines of text until she found the safe authorization list. Her finger stopped. She read the line again, certain she'd misunderstood. Then she read it a third time, and the first cold tendril of real fear began to wrap itself around her chest. The list had 3 names authorized to access the safe: Carolyn Mitchell, head of front-of-house operations; Samuel Drake, legal representative and financial officer; Evan Cole. Owner and primary operator Tessa stood in the office, staring at the paper, as the words rearranged themselves in her mind, as the past 3 weeks reassembled themselves into a completely different picture. The dishwasher who came in quietly and never made trouble. The man who always seemed to be there during the most difficult shifts. The person who knew where everything was, who helped train new staff, who understood the restaurant's operations with an intimacy that only made sense if, oh God, oh God. The paper slipped from Tessa's fingers and fluttered to the desk. She thought about her first day when she'd been shown around by Carolyn, who'd introduced her to everyone except, she'd realized later, the dishwasher, who'd been scrubbing pans in the back. She thought about how Carolyn had started to say something, had looked toward the dish pit, had opened her mouth and then closed it again. She thought about the staff meetings she'd held, where she'd outlined her new vision for the restaurant, her plans for modernization, her criticism of the outdated, sentimental approach that had been holding Harbor Street Bistro back. She'd said those things while Evan had been in the back, washing dishes, saying nothing. She thought about last week, when she'd instituted a new rule about staff not taking food home, about how she'd lectured everyone about theft and accountability while Evan had stood in the corner, his hands in soapy water, his expression carefully blank. She thought about 2 days ago, when she'd pulled Carolyn aside and told her that she was too emotionally involved with the staff, that she needed to maintain professional distance, that this isn't a family, it's a business. She'd said those words while Evan had been taking out the trash, moving past them without acknowledgement. He'd heard everything. He'd heard every criticism, every judgment, every dismissal of the culture he'd built, and he'd said nothing. Why? The question echoed in Tessa's mind as she stood in the office. His office, she realized with growing horror, staring at the paper on the desk. Why would he let her believe he was just a dishwasher? Why would he let her tear apart everything he'd built without saying a word? Why would he submit to her authority when he was the one who'd hired her in the first place? Or had he? Tessa's mind raced backward through her hiring process. She'd been contacted by a corporate consulting firm. They'd told her that the restaurant ownership had retained them to find new management. She'd interviewed with Samuel Drake, the man listed on the safe authorization as legal representative and financial officer. She'd never met the owner. She'd assumed she'd been told that the owner was largely absent, that the restaurant was essentially being run by a board, that her job was to step in and take control of day-to-day operations. She'd never asked who the owner was. She'd never thought to ask. Because who expects the owner to be washing dishes? Tessa picked up the paper with shaking hands and walked back to the kitchen. The scene hadn't changed, except now everyone was looking at her with expressions that had shifted from grief to something else, something that might have been pity. The sergeant turned as Tessa entered. "Did you find the authorization list?" Tessa couldn't speak. She simply held out the paper. The sergeant took it, read it, and then looked at Evan with an expression that confirmed what Tessa already knew. The younger officer read over his partner's shoulder, and Tessa watched his eyes widen. "Sir," the sergeant said to Evan, her voice completely different now. "Are you Evan Cole?" "Yes," Evan said quietly. "And you're the owner of this restaurant?" "Yes." The sergeant looked at the younger officer and nodded. The officer immediately stepped back from Evan, his hand moving away from his belt. "Mr. Cole," the sergeant said, "I apologize for the confusion. You're free to step away from the sink." Evan turned around slowly, lowering his hands. His expression hadn't changed. He still wore that mask of careful neutrality, but his eyes, when they finally settled on Tessa, contained something that made her want to disappear. Not anger. That would have been easier. It was disappointment. "I see you found the list," Evan said softly. Tessa's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her brain had short-circuited. Everything she'd been certain of had inverted. Every assumption had been revealed as catastrophically wrong. She'd called the police on the owner of the restaurant. She'd accused him of theft. She'd had him stand against a sink with his hands raised while his 7-year-old son watched in terror. She finally managed. Why didn't I tell you?" Evan's voice remained soft, but there was something underneath it now, something that might have been exhaustion or might have been the kind of sadness that comes from having your worst fears about humanity confirmed. "I told you I was closing the safe, Tessa. You didn't want to listen." "But you never said you were. You let me think." "I let you think what you chose to think," Evan said. "I let you see what you expected to see." The sergeant cleared her throat. "Mr. Cole, to clarify the situation, this money was withdrawn from your own safe for your own personal use?" "For my son's school field trip tomorrow," Evan confirmed. $200 for entry fees, lunch, and transportation. The permission slip is in my car if you need to verify." "That won't be necessary." The sergeant turned to Tessa, and now there was something else in her expression, something harder. "Ma'am, did you actually witness any theft occurring?" I saw him near the safe and the cash." "Did you see him take anything from the safe?" "No, but did he attempt to leave the premises with the money?" "No, he was still here, but did he resist when you confronted him?" "No, but that doesn't—" "Ma'am," the sergeant said, and her voice had gone very cold. "You called 911 to report a theft that didn't occur by a man who had every right to access his own safe and withdraw his own money in his own restaurant. Do you understand that filing a false police report is a crime?" Tessa felt the floor drop out from under her. I thought—" "You thought wrong," the sergeant said flatly. She turned back to Evan. "Mr. Cole, do you want to press charges against Miss Monroe for filing a false report?" The kitchen held its breath. Liam had lifted his head from Miguel's shoulder and was looking at his father with red-rimmed eyes. Carolyn's hand was pressed against her mouth again. Marcus had moved closer to Miguel, and all three of the longtime staff members were looking at Evan with expressions that contained both grief and something else, something that looked almost like hope. This was the moment where he could destroy her, where he could do to her what she'd tried to do to him, where he could exercise the power she'd tried to deny he had. Evan looked at Tessa for a long moment, and in that look she saw herself reflected back, saw herself as he must have seen her for the past 3 weeks. Arrogant, dismissive, so certain of her own correctness that she'd never questioned her assumptions, so focused on efficiency and systems that she'd forgotten to see people. "No," Evan said finally. "No charges." The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." "Very well." The sergeant nodded to her partner, and both officers began moving toward the door. As they passed Tessa, the sergeant paused. "Ma'am, a word of advice. Next time, ask questions before you make accusations. It'll save everyone a lot of trouble." Then they were gone, and Tessa was left standing in the kitchen with the people whose lives she'd been trying to reorganize, whose culture she'd been trying to dismantle, whose loyalty she'd mistaken for complicity. And in the center of it all stood Evan Cole, exhausted single father, owner in hiding, dishwasher by choice, watching her with those disappointed eyes while his son clung to Miguel's shoulder, while his staff stood in a protective semicircle, while the truth of what she'd done began to sink in with crushing weight. In the parking lot, the man in the expensive suit, Samuel Drake, legal representative, reached the door just as the police were leaving. He stopped, exchanged a few words with the sergeant that Tessa couldn't hear, then pushed open the door and entered the kitchen. His eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen many crises unfold. When his gaze landed on Tessa, his expression hardened. "Tessa Monroe?" His voice was clipped, professional. "Yes," Tessa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk," Samuel Drake said, "right now." And as Tessa followed him toward the office, toward Evan's office, she felt the last pieces of her certainty crumble away. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences she faced, one thing had become absolutely clear. She'd walked into Harbor Street Bistro 3 weeks ago, believing she knew everything. She'd just discovered she'd known nothing at all. The office felt smaller with 3 people in it. Samuel Drake stood behind the desk, Evan's desk, his expensive suit a sharp contrast to the worn practicality of everything else in the room. Tessa sat in the chair across from him, the same chair where she'd conducted her efficiency reviews with staff members over the past 3 weeks, the same chair where she'd outlined her plans to modernize Harbor Street Bistro. Now she understood with crushing clarity that every word she'd spoken in this room had been heard, reported, analyzed. Evan stood by the door, his arms crossed, water still dripping from his hands onto the linoleum. He hadn't bothered to dry them. He hadn't bothered to change his posture or his expression. He simply watched as Samuel Drake opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder. "Ms. Monroe," Samuel began, his voice carrying the measured precision of someone who'd delivered bad news professionally for years. "I'm going to explain something to you, and I need you to listen without interrupting." Tessa nodded, though her throat had gone so dry she wasn't sure she could have spoken even if she'd wanted to. 4 years ago, Samuel continued, Evan Cole's wife, Rebecca, was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. She fought for 18 months. During that time, Evan spent every moment he wasn't running this restaurant sitting beside her hospital bed. He liquidated his personal savings to pay for experimental treatments. He mortgaged his home. He sold his car and bought a 15-year-old sedan so he could afford one more round of chemotherapy that might buy Rebecca another few months with their son. Tessa felt something cold settle in her stomach. Through the open door, she could hear the quiet sounds of the kitchen being cleaned, the staff moving around each other with practiced ease. She could hear Liam's voice asking Miguel something about soccer. "Rebecca died 2 years and 7 months ago," Samuel said, his voice softening slightly. "She died at 3 in the morning in their bedroom because she'd wanted to be home at the end, not in a hospital. Evan was holding her hand. Liam was asleep in the next room. And when the hospice nurse finally left at dawn, Evan sat on the edge of his bed and realized he had approximately 48 hours before the hospital bills, the mortgage company, and every other creditor came calling." Samuel paused, looking at Evan, who hadn't moved from his position by the door. His face remained impassive, but something in his eyes had gone distant, traveling backward to a grief that Tessa couldn't begin to imagine. "The restaurant was the only asset he had left," Samuel continued. "So Evan made a decision. He transferred ownership to a family trust, brought me on as the legal representative, and restructured the business to protect it from his personal debts. Then he did something that most people in his position wouldn't have done. Instead of declaring bankruptcy and walking away, he started paying back every cent he owed." Tessa's voice emerged as barely a whisper. "How?" "By working," Evan said from the doorway, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the office. His voice was quiet but steady. "I stepped away from active management and took on hourly work. Dishwashing, prep cooking, whatever was needed. The business kept running with Carolyn handling front of house and Miguel managing the kitchen. I worked 70, 80 hours a week between here and 2 other restaurant jobs. Every penny I didn't need for rent and food for Liam went to paying down the debt. For 2 years, Samuel added, Evan worked like this. No one outside the core staff knew who he was. New employees assumed he was just another worker. Vendors dealt with Carolyn or Miguel. The business stabilized, the debts got paid, and Harbor Street survived. Tessa felt herself shrinking in the chair. Then why am I here? Why did you hire a general manager if... Because 6 months ago, the last major debt was paid off, Samuel explained. Evan finally had breathing room. He could have stepped back into active management, taken his position as owner, but he'd noticed something during those 2 years of working anonymously. He'd learned things about how this restaurant functioned and how it didn't that he'd never seen when everyone knew he was the boss. People treat you differently when they think you have power, Evan said, his voice carrying a weight of experience that made Tessa's chest tighten. When they know you own the place, they tell you what they think you want to hear. They hide problems. They manage up instead of managing honestly. But when they think you're just another worker, you see the truth. You see how the culture really works. You see who the real leaders are. Samuel nodded. So Evan proposed an experiment. He wanted to hire a new general manager, someone with strong credentials and fresh ideas, and he wanted to see how that person would interact with the existing culture before revealing his identity. The idea was to give you time to understand the restaurant, to build relationships with the staff, to learn the systems that Evan had spent 9 years developing. I thought that after a month or two, once you'd settled in, I would reveal who I was, Evan said, and now there was something painful in his voice. I thought we'd work together. I thought you'd bring efficiency and systems, and I'd provide the institutional knowledge and the relationships. I thought it would strengthen the restaurant. The past tense landed like a physical blow. But that's not what happened, Tessa said, though it wasn't really a question. No, Evan agreed. That's not what happened. Samuel closed the folder on the desk. Ms. Monroe, in your 3 weeks here, you've instituted 11 new policies without consultation. You've reduced staff hours by 17%. You've eliminated the family meal tradition that the kitchen staff had maintained for 9 years. You've implemented a disciplinary point system that has created more anxiety than accountability. And you've done all of this while repeatedly telling the people who kept this restaurant alive through its darkest period that they were inefficient, outdated, and too emotionally attached to their work. Each item on the list felt like a slap. Tessa remembered the pride she'd felt in each of those changes, the sense of accomplishment at taking control of what she'd perceived as a rudderless operation. She remembered the entries in her daily reports to Samuel, reports she now understood were going directly to the man she'd been criticizing. The staff came to me after the first week, Evan said quietly. Miguel, Carolyn, even young Marcus. They told me what was happening. They asked me to step in, to reveal who I was, to stop it. Why didn't you? The question burst from Tessa before she could stop it. Evan was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a sadness that made Tessa want to disappear. Because I wanted to be wrong. I wanted to believe that someone with your credentials, your education, your confidence, would see past the surface and recognize what was actually valuable here. I wanted to believe that if I just gave you time, you'd start asking questions instead of making assumptions. But I didn't, Tessa whispered. No. Tonight, when you called the police on me in front of my son, that was the final confirmation that this experiment failed. Not because you made a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. But because in 3 weeks, you never once asked why things were the way they were. You never wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a reason behind the culture you were so eager to dismantle. The weight of it was crushing. Tessa looked at her hands, at the expensive manicure she'd gotten last week, at the diamond watch her parents had given her when she'd graduated with her MBA. Everything that had felt like validation of her worth now felt like evidence of how much she'd misunderstood. I'm fired, she said, and it wasn't a question. Samuel and Evan exchanged a look, and something passed between them that Tessa couldn't interpret. That's the question we need to discuss, Samuel said. Legally, yes, We have grounds for immediate termination. You falsely accused the owner of theft. You created a hostile work environment. You've damaged staff morale. Any one of those would be sufficient cause. What? Tessa waited for the axe to fall. But, Evan said, and the single word hung in the air like a lifeline, I've been thinking about something my wife said to me about 6 months before she died. He moved from the doorway, finally, coming to lean against the filing cabinet. His arms remained crossed, but his posture had softened slightly. Rebecca was a teacher, Evan continued, elementary school, and one day she came home frustrated because she'd had to discipline a student who'd been bullying another kid. I asked her what consequence she'd given, and she said she hadn't given a consequence at all. She'd given him a responsibility. Tessa looked up, confused. The kid had been bullying because he felt powerless in his own life, Evan explained. So instead of punishing him, Rebecca made him responsible for welcoming new students to the class, made him the person who showed them around, helped them feel safe, protected them from feeling lost and alone. She turned his capacity for cruelty into a capacity for care by giving him a reason to understand what it felt like to be vulnerable. 6 months later, that kid was one of the kindest in her class, Evan said softly. Not because she'd punished him, but because she'd taught him empathy by making him responsible for it. Tessa felt tears burning behind her eyes. I don't understand what you're saying. I'm saying, Evan replied, meeting her gaze directly, that I think you made the choices you made because you've never been taught to see things differently. You've been trained to value efficiency over humanity, to see systems over people, to measure success in metrics instead of moments. And tonight, you got a glimpse of what that approach actually costs. He straightened, his decision clearly made. So here's what's going to happen, Tessa. You're not fired, but you're demoted. As of right now, you're no longer general manager. You're a staff member. For the next 60 days, you're going to work every position in this restaurant. You're going to wash dishes with me. You're going to prep vegetables with Marcus. You're going to work the line with Miguel. You're going to serve tables with Carolyn. And you're going to learn what it actually takes to keep this place running. Tessa's mouth fell open. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious, Evan said. You'll be paid hourly, the same rate as everyone else in whatever position you're working. You'll follow the same rules, keep the same hours, do the same work. And at the end of 60 days, if you've actually learned something, we'll talk about whether there's a management position for you here. And if I refuse, Tessa asked, though she wasn't sure why she was asking. What choice did she have? Then you're terminated immediately, with cause, and you'll spend the next year trying to explain to potential employers why your last position ended with you calling the police on your own boss, Samuel said bluntly. Your choice. The two options weren't really options at all. One was humiliation, the other was career suicide. Tessa thought about her apartment, about her student loans, about the calls she'd have to make to her parents if she lost this job. She thought about starting over, about the gap in her resume, about the reference she definitely wouldn't get. When do I start? She asked, her voice hollow. Tomorrow morning, Evan said. 6 a.m. You'll be working the opening shift with me. We start with taking deliveries and breaking down boxes. Wear clothes you don't mind getting dirty. He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. Tessa, I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing it because I think you have the capacity to be better than you were tonight. But you can't lead people you don't understand, and you don't understand the people who work here. So you're going to become one of them, really become one of them. And maybe then you'll understand what you almost destroyed. Then he was gone, leaving Tessa alone with Samuel Drake, who was gathering his papers with methodical precision. For what it's worth, Samuel said as he closed his briefcase, I voted for firing you. Evan overruled me. He has a frustrating tendency to believe in people's capacity for change. He paused at the door. Don't make me right and him wrong, Ms. Monroe. Then Tessa was alone in the office, Evan's office, with nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the distant clatter of the kitchen being cleaned for the night. She sat there for a long time, her mind replaying the evening in excruciating detail. The certainty she'd felt when she'd called 911, the satisfaction of catching wrongdoing, the vindication of being right. Except she hadn't been right. She'd been catastrophically wrong. And worse than being wrong was the realization of why she'd been wrong. She hadn't asked questions. She hadn't sought context. She'd seen exactly what she'd expected to see because she'd already decided what story she was walking into. She thought about her first day, about Carolyn's incomplete introduction, about the way the head waitress had looked toward the dish pit with an expression Tessa had interpreted as protectiveness for a troubled employee rather than what it actually was. Grief for a man who'd lost everything and was rebuilding from nothing. She thought about the staff meeting where she'd lectured everyone about outdated business models, while Evan had stood in the back listening to her critique the culture he'd built, the family he'd created, the only thing that had survived the worst years of his life. She thought about this food policy she'd instituted: no taking food home, no family meals, strict inventory control, and she understood now what that must have meant to people who'd kept this restaurant alive while Evan worked 3 jobs to pay medical bills for a wife who'd died anyway. Tessa put her head in her hands and finally let herself cry. Not tears of self-pity, though there was some of that. Mostly, she cried because for 3 weeks she'd been hurting people and calling it leadership. She'd been destroying something precious and calling it improvement. She'd been blind to humanity and calling it professionalism. Eventually, the tears stopped. Tessa wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up. Through the office window, she could see into the kitchen. Most of the staff had left, but Miguel was still there, patiently teaching Liam how to properly clean a cutting board. The boy was standing on a step stool, his small hands mimicking Miguel's movements, and the sous chef was praising him with the kind of gentle encouragement that spoke of long practice. Carolyn appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Miguel, ruffled Liam's hair, and said something that made the boy laugh. The 3 of them stood together in the quiet kitchen, comfortable with each other in a way that only comes from years of shared experience and genuine care. This was what Tessa had walked into 3 weeks ago. Not a struggling restaurant with poor management, but a family that had survived tragedy together. Not inefficiency, but loyalty. Not sentiment clouding judgment, but love making judgment possible. And she'd looked at all of it and seen only problems to fix. Tessa left the office and walked through the kitchen. Miguel looked up as she passed, his expression neutral but not hostile. Liam peered at her with curiosity, probably wondering who the lady was who'd gotten his dad in trouble. Carolyn met her eyes, and in that look, Tessa saw something she hadn't earned but was being offered anyway, the possibility of redemption. 6 a.m. tomorrow, Carolyn said quietly. Don't be late. Evan has no patience for people who waste his time. I won't be late, Tessa promised. She walked out the back door into the parking lot, where her Audi sat next to Evan's ancient sedan. Through the sedan's windows, she could see a booster seat in the back, a backpack covered in superhero patches, a rumpled blanket. The car of a single father doing his best. Tessa got into her Audi and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Her phone buzzed with text messages from friends asking about dinner plans, about weekend trips, about trivial things that belonged to a version of herself that now felt impossibly distant. She'd come to Harbor Street Bistro 3 weeks ago believing she was going to save a struggling restaurant. Instead, she'd nearly destroyed the one thing that had saved a grieving widower and his son. Tomorrow, she would start learning what she should have learned on day 1. Tomorrow, she would begin understanding what leadership actually meant. Tomorrow, she would wash dishes beside the man she'd accused of theft, and maybe, just maybe, she would start to see past her own assumptions to the truth underneath. But tonight, sitting in her expensive car in the parking lot of a restaurant she'd thought she understood, Tessa Monroe finally admitted to herself the one thing her education and experience had never taught her. She didn't know everything. In fact, she was beginning to suspect she didn't know much of anything at all. Inside the restaurant, Evan lifted Liam into his arms. The boy was tired, his head already drooping against his father's shoulder. "Dad!" Liam's voice was soft, muffled. "Is that lady going to be okay?" Evan thought about the question as he grabbed his jacket. The jacket where Tessa had seen money and assumed theft, where the truth was permission slips and field trip fees and the small pieces of normalcy he was trying to give his son, despite everything they'd lost. "I don't know, buddy," Evan said honestly, "but I'm going to give her the chance to try." "Like Mama would have?" Liam asked. Evan felt his throat tighten. Even 2 years later, the grief could ambush him at unexpected moments. His son's casual invocation of Rebecca's name, the easy assumption that she would have done exactly what Evan was doing,
The simple faith that his father's choices reflected his mother's values. Yeah, Evan managed, like Mama would have. They walked out together into the parking lot. Evan buckled Liam into the booster seat, tucked the blanket around him, and kissed his forehead.
By the time he got into the driver's seat, Liam was already asleep, his small chest rising and falling with the perfect peace of childhood. Evan started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, passing Tessa's Audi on the way. He could see her silhouette behind the wheel, motionless, and he wondered what she was thinking, whether she understood yet what she'd stumbled into, whether she had any idea what the next 60 days would actually require of her. He thought about calling Samuel, about discussing contingency plans in case Tessa quit or failed or proved incapable of change, but he was tired, so tired, and Liam needed to be home and in bed, and tomorrow would come early with deliveries and prep work, and the 1,000 small tasks that kept a restaurant alive. So instead, Evan drove home through quiet streets, carried his sleeping son inside, tucked him into bed still wearing his light-up sneakers because sometimes being a good parent meant picking your battles. He stood in the doorway of Liam's room for a long moment, watching his son sleep, thinking about all the ways the world could be cruel and unfair, about all the ways people could hurt each other through ignorance or malice or simple failure to see. And he thought about Rebecca, about her student who'd learned kindness through responsibility, about her absolute faith that people could change if you gave them the right reasons and the right tools. "I hope you're right," Evan whispered into the darkness. "I hope she can learn." Then he closed the door gently and went to his own room where he set his alarm for 5 a.m. and tried not to think about whether he'd just made a terrible mistake or taken the first step towards something better. In her apartment across town, Tessa lay awake in her expensive bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine herself washing dishes at 6 in the morning, trying to picture herself taking orders from people she'd been giving orders to just hours before, trying to understand how her certainty had led her so catastrophically astray. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Liam's terrified face, saw Evan's disappointed eyes, saw the grief in Carolyn's expression as the police had arrived. She'd done that. Not the restaurant's problems, not the staff's resistance, not the outdated systems. Her. Tessa Monroe, MBA, certified manager, professional leader. She had looked at a man grieving his wife and rebuilding his life and seen only a thief. She had looked at loyalty and seen complicity. She had looked at love and seen inefficiency. Around 3 in the morning, Tessa finally gave up on sleep. She got up, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop. She opened a document and started writing, not a report, not an analysis, but something closer to a confession. She wrote about her assumptions, her judgments, her certainty. She wrote about the moment she'd called 911, about the satisfaction she'd felt, about the shame that came after. She wrote until dawn broke through her windows, until her coffee went cold, until her fingers cramped. And when she finally stopped, she had 12 pages of single-spaced text that would never be read by anyone but herself. But writing it had changed something. It had forced her to see her own choices with clarity. It had made her accountable to herself in a way that no external consequence could. At 5:30 a.m., Tessa showered, put on old jeans and a t-shirt, and drove back to Harbor Street Bistro. She arrived at 5:50, 10 minutes early, and found Evan already there, standing by the back door with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without comment. "Thank you," Tessa said quietly. Evan nodded. Then he opened the door and led her inside into the dim kitchen where the day was just beginning, where the real work of learning was about to start. "First lesson," Evan said, flipping on the lights. "In a restaurant, everything matters. The dishes matter. The prep work matters. The way you treat the delivery driver matters. Nothing is beneath you because nothing actually works without everything working together." Tessa nodded, gripping her coffee cup like a lifeline. "Second lesson," Evan continued, pulling on a worn apron and tossing another one to Tessa. "Everyone who works here has a story. Your job, your real job, for the next 60 days, is to learn those stories. Not to manage them, not to fix them, but to understand them." "Okay," Tessa said, tying the apron with trembling fingers. Evan looked at her for a long moment, and in the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the lines that grief and struggle had carved there. But she could also see something else, a kind of determined hope that maybe, just maybe, this would work. "Let's get started," Evan said. And as the delivery truck pulled up outside, as the morning began to unfold with its rhythm of boxes and prep and the thousand small tasks that kept a restaurant alive, Tessa Monroe took her first real step toward understanding what she should have known all along. That leadership isn't about control or systems or efficiency. It's about people. Always, it's about people. The delivery truck's engine rumbled to a stop outside, and Tessa realized with sudden clarity that she had no idea what came next. In all her years of management training, in all her carefully constructed systems and procedures, she'd never once actually unloaded a delivery truck at 6 in the morning. Evan was already moving toward the back door, and Tessa followed, her new apron feeling strange and uncomfortable around her waist. The early morning air hit her face, still cool with the last remnants of night, and she watched as Evan greeted the delivery driver with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. "Morning, Frank," Evan said, accepting a clipboard and scanning the invoice quickly. "Morning, Evan. Got your produce order, and they threw in some extra basil, said it wouldn't make it through the weekend." Frank was probably in his 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades starting work before dawn. "Appreciate it." "Tessa, grab those crates by the door," Evan said without looking at her, already hefting a box of tomatoes. Tessa moved forward and gripped the handles of a plastic crate, immediately understanding why Evan had told her to wear clothes she didn't mind ruining. The crate was heavier than it looked, packed with heads of lettuce still wet from their morning washing, and water sloshed over the sides as she lifted it. By the time she'd carried it inside, her shirt was soaked and her arms were shaking. "Walk-in cooler, left side, bottom shelf," Evan called over his shoulder, already carrying in a second load. Tessa found the walk-in, a massive refrigerated room she'd seen before but never actually entered, and maneuvered the crate onto the indicated shelf. The cold air bit through her wet shirt, making her shiver. When she emerged, Evan was already bringing in another load, moving with the efficient rhythm of someone who'd done this thousands of times. For the next 40 minutes, they unloaded Frank's truck in silence. Boxes of produce, crates of dairy, containers of proteins. Everything had its place, its proper rotation, its specific storage requirements. Evan showed her once, expected her to remember, and corrected her when she put something in the wrong location. "First in, first out," he said when she tried to place fresh milk in front of older containers. "Always rotate stock. The dated items go in front so they get used first. Otherwise, we waste product and waste money." Tessa repositioned the milk, her fingers already numb from the cold. Her expensive manicure was ruined, one nail already chipped. Her back ached from bending and lifting, and it was only 6:30 in the morning. When Frank's truck finally pulled away, Evan led Tessa back inside to the dry storage area and handed her a box cutter. "Now we break down the boxes and organize the supplies. Coffee filters here, napkins there, to-go containers on that shelf." "Why do you do this yourself?" The question emerged before Tessa could stop it. "You're the owner, couldn't you?" "Could I what? Delegate it? Pay someone else to show up at 6 a.m. so I don't have to?" Evan's voice wasn't harsh, but it was firm. "Tessa, the first lesson you need to learn is that there's no such thing as work that's beneath you. The moment you start thinking some tasks are below your dignity is the moment you stop understanding what actually keeps this place running." He sliced open a box of paper towels with practiced efficiency. "Besides, I like the quiet of the morning. I like knowing exactly what comes in, what condition it's in, what we have to work with. It's one less thing that can go wrong." They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the slice of box cutters through cardboard and the rustle of supplies being stocked. Tessa's hands developed blisters where the cardboard edges rubbed against unfamiliar skin. She'd never realized how much physical labor went into running a restaurant before the customers even arrived. Around 7:15, the back door opened again and Miguel arrived, his eyes registering surprise when he saw Tessa in an apron surrounded by flattened cardboard boxes. "Morning, Jefe," Miguel said to Evan, then nodded cautiously at Tessa. "Morning." "Morning, Miguel. Tessa's working the opening shift today. She'll be rotating through all the positions for the next couple months." Miguel's expression remained carefully neutral, but Tessa could see the questions in his eyes. The last time he'd seen her, she'd been calling the police on his boss. Now she was breaking down delivery boxes like any other staff member. The cognitive dissonance must have been staggering. Okay, Miguel said simply. He moved to the kitchen and began his own morning routine, checking the line, reviewing prep lists, starting the process of transforming ingredients into the day's menu. Marcus arrived at 7:30, his eyes widening when he saw Tessa. "Oh, hey." "Hey," Tessa replied, feeling the weight of his uncertainty. She wanted to apologize, to explain, but Evan was already assigning tasks. "Marcus, you're on vegetable prep. Tessa, you're helping him. Miguel will show you both what needs to be done for lunch service." And just like that, Tessa found herself at a stainless steel prep table with a cutting board, a knife, and 20 pounds of onions that needed to be diced. Marcus worked beside her, his movements quick and efficient, his knife creating a rhythmic sound against the cutting board that Tessa couldn't begin to match. "Like this," Marcus said after watching her struggle for a few minutes. He demonstrated the proper way to hold the knife, the rocking motion that made cutting efficient, the technique for keeping her fingers tucked safely away from the blade. You want to let the knife do the work. Don't saw at it. Tessa tried to mimic his movements, but her cuts were uneven and slow. Within minutes, her eyes were streaming from the onion fumes, and she had to stop to wipe them with her sleeve, which only made it worse. "Don't touch your face," Marcus said, handing her a clean towel. "Makes it worse. Just power through. Your eyes adjust after a while." "How long have you worked here?" Tessa asked, trying to focus through the burning in her eyes. 8 months, Marcus replied, starting on his third onion while Tessa was still struggling through her first. "I was working at a chain restaurant across town. Hated it. One of my friends told me Harbor Street was hiring, said it was different here, said the owner actually gave a shit about the staff." The words landed with quiet accusation, though Marcus's tone remained neutral. "He applied the same day I did," Marcus continued. "We both got hired, but my friend quit after 2 weeks, said it was too much work, too many expectations. I stayed because I realized the expectations weren't about working harder. They were about working better, about caring about what you were doing." He glanced at Tessa, and she could see him weighing whether to say more. "Evan never told me he was the owner. I found out about 3 months in when I overheard Carolyn talking about the anniversary of Rebecca's death. I was angry at first, felt like he'd been lying to me. But then I understood why he did it." "Why?" Tessa asked, genuinely curious. "Because he wanted to know if I was the kind of person who would work hard and show respect regardless of who was watching. He wanted to know if I'd take pride in my work because it mattered to me, not because the boss was around." Marcus finished another onion and reached for the next. "That's what this place is about. Not systems or efficiency or metrics. It's about whether you actually care." The implicit criticism was clear. Tessa had spent 3 weeks implementing systems and metrics while failing to understand the one thing that actually mattered. She bent over her cutting board, her tears now coming from more than just the onions, and tried to work faster. By 8 o'clock, her hands were cramping and she'd only finished 4 onions. Marcus had finished 15 and moved on to dicing peppers. Miguel appeared periodically to check their progress, offering quiet corrections to Tessa's technique, but never making her feel incompetent. Just persistent, patient instruction. "You'll get faster," Miguel said, watching her struggle. "Everyone's slow at first. The trick is consistency. Same size pieces, same technique every time. Eventually your hands remember and you don't have to think about it anymore." Carolyn arrived at 8:30 to start setting up the front of the house, and the look she gave Tessa was complicated. Part sympathy, part wariness, part something that might have been respect for the fact that Tessa had actually shown up. "Coffee's fresh if you need it," Carolyn said, then disappeared into the dining room to begin her own opening procedures. Tessa wanted the coffee desperately, but she was only halfway through her onion assignment, and she could feel everyone's eyes on her, measuring whether she would finish what she'd started or give up. So she kept cutting, kept wiping her streaming eyes, kept pushing through the cramping in her hands until finally, mercifully, the last onion was diced. "Good," Evan said, appearing at her elbow. She hadn't realized he'd been watching. "Now you understand why we need sharp knives and why prep work starts early. If you'd had to do that during service, we'd have been backed up for hours." He handed her a new assignment, 40 carrots that needed to be peeled and julienned. Marcus had already finished his peppers and moved on to mincing garlic, the smell of it mixing with the onions to create the foundation of whatever dishes were being prepared for lunch. The morning stretched on in a blur of repetitive tasks: peel, cut, dice, mince. Tessa's hands developed new blisters on top of the old ones. Her back ached from standing. Her shoulders burned from the unfamiliar motions. And still the work continued because, in a restaurant, stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind meant chaos during service. Around 10:30, Miguel called everyone together for what he called the pre-service meeting. The lunch crew had arrived: 2 more line cooks, a dishwasher, and another server to help Carolyn. They gathered around the kitchen's central prep table while Miguel reviewed the day's specials, discussed any modifications to regular menu items, and outlined what they expected for volume. Tessa stood on the periphery, feeling like an outsider in a world she'd thought she understood. These people had a language all their own: all day, in the weeds, 86, terms she'd heard before but never truly understood the weight of. They communicated in shorthand built on years of working together, anticipating each other's needs, functioning as a unit rather than individuals. "Tessa, you're on dish with Ray during lunch service," Evan said, and Tessa felt her stomach drop. She'd seen the dish pit during her management tours: the massive industrial sinks, the commercial dishwasher that roared like a jet engine, the endless stream of dirty plates and pans. She'd always hurried past it, uncomfortable with the heat and noise and chaos. Now she was about to spend the next 4 hours immersed in it. Ray, the lunch dishwasher, was a man in his 50s with arms covered in faded tattoos and a gentle smile that didn't match his intimidating appearance. "Don't worry," he said, seeing Tessa's expression. "I'll show you the system. It's not complicated, just relentless." That turned out to be the understatement of the century. Service started at 11, and within 15 minutes, Tessa understood what Ray meant by relentless. The dirty dishes came in waves: plates scraped but still covered in sauce, pans crusted with burned food, utensils sticky with use. Everything had to be scraped, soaked, scrubbed, sent through the industrial dishwasher, and then returned to the appropriate station. And it never stopped. "Scrape first, then spray, then load," Ray instructed over the roar of the dishwasher. "Keep the clean dishes coming because the moment we fall behind, the whole kitchen backs up. No clean plates means no plating. No clean pans means no cooking." Tessa tried to match Ray's pace, but she was hopelessly slow. Her hands, already blistered from the morning's prep work, screamed in protest as she plunged them into near-scalding water. The spray nozzle was heavy and unwieldy, and she kept forgetting to aim it properly, soaking herself and the floor around her. Within an hour, she was drenched in water and food particles, her feet sliding in her soaked shoes, her entire body aching from the constant bending and lifting. "Behind you!" someone yelled, and Tessa jumped back just in time to avoid colliding with a line cook carrying a hot pan. This was another language she was learning: the constant navigation of a crowded kitchen, the necessary communication to avoid accidents, the awareness of everything and everyone around you. The lunch rush peaked around 12:30, and Tessa felt like she was drowning. The dirty dishes piled up faster than she could process them. Ray worked with mechanical efficiency beside her, never rushing but never stopping, maintaining a steady rhythm that kept the clean dishes flowing even as the dirty ones multiplied. "You're thinking too much," Ray said during a brief lull. "Your body needs to remember the pattern: scrape, spray, load, start the machine, empty the machine, return the clean dishes, over and over. Stop thinking about it, and just do it." Tessa tried to follow his advice, tried to let her body take over, but her mind kept interjecting with questions and doubts and complaints about the heat and the noise and the sheer physical exhaustion of it all. Her expensive watch, she'd forgotten to take it off, was covered in food debris and soap scum. Her clothes were completely ruined, and still the dishes kept coming. At one point, she dropped a plate. It shattered against the concrete floor, and the sound cut through the kitchen noise like a gunshot. Everything stopped for just a second, all eyes turning toward the dish pit, toward Tessa standing frozen with pieces of broken ceramic at her feet. "It happens," Ray said calmly, already reaching for the broom. "Get the dustpan. We clean it up and keep moving." But Miguel appeared before Tessa could move, his expression serious. "Everyone okay? No cuts?" "We're fine," Ray assured him. "Just a plate." "You have to be careful," Miguel said, looking at Tessa. "Broken glass or ceramic in a kitchen, that's dangerous. Not just for you, but for everyone.
One shard gets into the floor drain and someone reaches in without knowing. That's an emergency room visit. The weight of responsibility settled on Tessa's shoulders. She'd thought washing dishes was simple, mindless work, but she was beginning to understand that nothing in this kitchen was simple. Every task had implications. Every mistake had consequences, and everyone depended on everyone else to do their job correctly. They cleaned up the broken plate carefully, checking the floor drain, sweeping multiple times to ensure no fragments remained. And then, because the lunch rush was still going, they returned to the endless cycle of scraping and washing and loading. By 2 o'clock, when the rush finally began to slow, Tessa's hands were shaking from exhaustion. Her back felt like it might snap. Her feet throbbed in her soaked shoes, and they still had another hour of service plus the full breakdown and cleaning of the dish pit. Ray handed her a bottle of water. "Drink. You've been working in heat for 4 hours. You need to hydrate." Tessa drank gratefully, the cold water shocking against her overheated throat. Around her, the kitchen was transitioning from the controlled chaos of service to the methodical work of cleanup. Line cooks were breaking down their stations, scrubbing grills, organizing their mise en place for dinner service. Carolyn and the other server were resetting tables in the dining room, preparing for the brief lull before evening customers arrived. And Evan was everywhere, checking with Miguel about how service had gone, helping Ray with a particularly stubborn pot, wiping down prep surfaces, talking to Carolyn about a reservation for that evening. He moved through the kitchen like a conductor through an orchestra, not directing but harmonizing, making sure every section had what it needed. When he finally made his way to the dish pit, Tessa was scrubbing the industrial sink with a brush that felt like it weighed 50 pounds. "How are you holding up?" Evan asked. Tessa wanted to say she was fine, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity, but her body had reached its limit, and honesty seemed like the only option left. "I had no idea," she said quietly. "I had no idea how hard this was." Evan nodded, leaning against the wall beside the dish pit. "Most people don't. They see the finished product, the meal on the table, the clean restaurant, the smooth service. They don't see the 5 a.m. deliveries, the hours of prep, the burns and cuts and exhaustion. They don't see Ray coming in day after day to wash dishes because if he doesn't, nothing else works." He looked at her with those exhausted eyes that had seen so much. "That's why I needed you to do this, Tessa. Not to punish you, but to teach you. You can't lead people whose work you don't understand. You can't make decisions about efficiency without knowing what those decisions actually cost in human effort and dignity." Tessa nodded, too tired to speak. "Go home," Evan said. "Ray can finish the breakdown. Come back tomorrow at 6 a.m. We'll do it again." "But I haven't finished." "You've done enough for your first day. Tomorrow will be harder because your body will be sore and your hands will hurt worse and you'll be tempted to quit. Don't quit. Show up. That's the only real requirement. Just show up and try." Tessa untied her soaking apron with clumsy fingers. Her hands were red and wrinkled from the water, the blisters open and weeping. She couldn't remember ever being this physically exhausted in her entire life. As she walked toward the back door, Marcus looked up from where he was organizing the walk-in cooler. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the first small seed of understanding. "See you tomorrow?" Marcus asked. "Yeah," Tessa replied. "See you tomorrow." She made it to her car before the full weight of the day hit her. Every muscle in her body was screaming. Her hands could barely grip the steering wheel. Her clothes were ruined beyond saving, reeking of dish soap and food waste and sweat. This was one day. One single day of the work that people like Ray and Marcus and Miguel did every single day, often for wages that barely covered their bills. Tessa drove home in a daze, her mind replaying the countless small moments of the morning and afternoon. The weight of the delivery crates, the burning of her eyes from the onions, the endless cascade of dirty dishes. The broken plate, and Miguel's quiet reminder of how one small mistake could have serious consequences. The language of the kitchen that she was only beginning to understand. The shorthand communication, the practiced coordination, the mutual dependence that made everything work. She thought about her management textbooks, her MBA courses, her carefully constructed theories about efficiency and productivity. None of them had prepared her for the reality of standing at a dish sink for 4 hours, muscles screaming, while the lunch rush pounded the kitchen into controlled chaos.
None of them had explained that leadership wasn't about systems or metrics. It was about understanding the human cost of every decision. When she finally reached her apartment, Tessa stood under the shower for 20 minutes, watching the water run brown with the residue of the day's work. Her hands stung when the water hit the open blisters. Her back had a knot between her shoulder blades that felt permanent. Her feet were swollen from standing on concrete for 8 hours. And tomorrow, she would do it all again. Tessa dried off carefully, bandaged her worst blisters, and collapsed into bed even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. Sleep came immediately, deep and dreamless, her body demanding the rest it had earned. She woke at midnight, disoriented, her body stiff and protesting even the simple act of rolling over. In the darkness of her bedroom, Tessa finally allowed herself to fully confront what she'd done. Not just the false accusation and the police call, though those were bad enough, but the 3 weeks of casual cruelty that had preceded them. The dismissal of people's work, the elimination of traditions that had held a grieving community together, the certainty that she knew better than people who'd been keeping the restaurant alive while she was still in graduate school. She thought about Ray, who'd washed dishes with patient expertise while she'd struggled and fumbled. She thought about Marcus, who'd taught her how to hold a knife after she'd spent 3 weeks telling him his work wasn't efficient enough. She thought about Miguel, who checked on her after the broken plate not with anger but with concern for everyone's safety. She thought about Carolyn, who'd offered her coffee even though Tessa had called the police on the man Carolyn had protected for years. These weren't inefficient workers who needed better management. They were skilled professionals who'd been doing exceptional work despite having someone actively undermining their efforts. Tessa got up, padded to her kitchen, and made tea with hands that shook from more than just exhaustion. She sat at her table in the darkness and faced the most uncomfortable truth of all. She'd become exactly what she'd always claimed to despise. She'd become the kind of leader who confused authority with knowledge, who mistook compliance for respect, who thought control was the same thing as competence. And it had taken being handcuffed in front of a 7-year-old boy to shatter that delusion. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a text from her mother. "Haven't heard from you in a few days. Everything okay with the new job?" Tessa stared at the message for a long time. What could she possibly say? That she'd spectacularly failed at everything she thought she was good at? That she'd called the police on her own boss? That she'd spent the day washing dishes and learning that everything she'd believed about leadership was fundamentally wrong? She typed back, "Job's going through some changes. I'll call you this weekend." It was cowardly and evasive, but it was all she could manage. Tessa returned to bed, but sleep wouldn't come again. Her mind kept circling back to the kitchen, to the rhythm of the work, to the way everyone moved together with practiced coordination. She thought about Evan, who owned the restaurant but showed up at 6 a.m. to unload trucks, who'd lost his wife and nearly lost everything else, but had chosen to rebuild by returning to the most basic work, not because he had to, but because he wanted to understand what was really happening in his own business. What had he seen during those 2 years of working anonymously? What had he learned about his staff, his systems, his culture? And what had he seen in Tessa that made him believe she was worth teaching rather than simply firing? The questions gnawed at her as the night slowly gave way to dawn. When her alarm went off at 5 a.m., Tessa's body screamed in protest. Every movement hurt. Her hands were so swollen she could barely make a fist. The simple act of getting dressed required multiple rest breaks. But she got up. She put on her ruined clothes from yesterday because they were already destroyed, so there was no point in ruining another outfit. She bandaged her hands as best she could, and she drove back to Harbor Street Bistro, arriving at 5:50 to find Evan already there with 2 cups of coffee, just like the day before. "How do you feel?" Evan asked, handing her the coffee. "Like I got hit by a truck," Tessa said honestly. Evan's expression softened slightly. "It gets easier. Your body adjusts. The first week is the hardest." "First week?" Tessa couldn't keep the dismay from her voice. "Tessa, you're going to be here for 60 days, rotating through every position. That means you're going to wash dishes, prep vegetables, work the line, serve tables, and eventually help with ordering and inventory. Each position for long enough that you actually understand it, not just observe it." He paused, taking a sip of his own coffee. "Today, you're back on prep with Marcus. Tomorrow, you'll start learning the line. Every day builds on the one before. The delivery truck arrived, and the cycle began again. Crates and boxes, rotation and storage, breaking down cardboard and stocking shelves. Tessa's bandaged hands made everything harder, but she pushed through, determined not to show weakness. Marcus greeted her with a nod when she joined him at the prep station. Today's assignment was butternut squash, 20 of them that needed to be peeled, seeded, and diced. The work was even harder than the onions had been, the squash tough and resistant, her sore hands struggling with the peeler. "You came back," Marcus said after they'd worked in silence for a while. "Yeah," Tessa replied, wrestling with a particularly stubborn squash. "Honestly, I bet Miguel $5 you'd quit after day one." Tessa looked up, startled. Marcus shrugged. "Nothing personal. It's just people who've never done this kind of work. They usually don't last. They think they can, but when their body starts hurting and they realize how hard it actually is, they find reasons to leave." "What made you take that bet?" "Because Miguel said something about Evan believing in second chances. Said if Evan thought you could learn, maybe you actually could." Marcus returned to his work, his knife moving efficiently through the squash. "I hope he's right. This place deserves better than what you were doing to it." The words stung, but Tessa couldn't argue with them. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For what I did. For all of it." Marcus didn't respond immediately, just kept working. Finally, he said, "Don't apologize to me. Apologize by showing up and doing the work. Apologize by learning what you should have learned 3 weeks ago. Words don't mean anything in a kitchen, only actions do." So Tessa worked. She peeled and diced squash until her hands cramped. She followed Marcus's patient instructions on technique. She kept showing up to the prep station even when every part of her body was begging her to stop. And slowly, incrementally, she began to understand what Marcus had meant about actions mattering more than words. The kitchen had its own justice system, its own way of measuring worth, and that measurement had nothing to do with titles or credentials or the right thing said in the right tone. It was purely about whether you showed up, whether you did your part, whether you could be counted on when things got hard. Tessa was beginning to realize she'd never been tested that way before. She'd spent her entire career in environments where her credentials spoke for her, where her education opened doors, where her confidence was mistaken for competence. But here, in this kitchen, none of that mattered. Here, the only thing that counted was whether she could peel 20 butternut squashes while her hands bled and her back screamed and her pride lay in pieces around her feet. And as the morning stretched on, as lunch service loomed and the prep work continued in its relentless rhythm, Tessa discovered something unexpected. There was a kind of dignity in this work, a kind of honesty that she'd never encountered in boardrooms or management meetings. When you washed dishes or diced vegetables or unloaded delivery trucks, there was no pretense, no performance, no hiding behind jargon or credentials. There was only the work itself, and whether you could do it. By the end of the first week, Tessa's body had adapted in ways she hadn't thought possible. The blisters on her hands had hardened into calluses. Her back had stopped screaming with every movement and settled into a dull, persistent ache. Her arms no longer trembled when she lifted the delivery crates, though they still burned with effort. She'd learned to move through the kitchen without constantly colliding with people, had internalized the rhythm of behind you and hot pan and corner that kept everyone safe in the confined space. But the physical adaptation was only part of what was changing. Something deeper was shifting in the way Tessa understood the world around her. On her 8th day, Evan moved her from prep work to the line during dinner service. Miguel positioned her at the salad station, the simplest position, he explained, because it required speed and accuracy but no actual cooking. Her job was to build each salad according to the ticket, ensure proper portions, dress it correctly, and get it out to the pass before the hot items were ready so everything could be plated together. "Watch the tickets," Miguel instructed, pointing to the small printer that chattered constantly during service, spitting out order after order. "They come in groups. Apps first, then mains. You need to read ahead, anticipate what's coming, and time your salads so they're ready when the entrees hit the pass." It sounded simple in theory. In practice, during the Friday night dinner rush, it was controlled chaos. The tickets came faster than Tessa could process them. 4 house salads, 2 Caesars, 3 mixed greens with the dressing on the side. Then another wave before she'd finished the first. Her hands, still sore despite the calluses, fumbled with the tongs. She dressed a salad too heavily and had to start over because Miguel wouldn't let substandard work leave the kitchen. She fell behind, creating a backup that rippled through the entire line. "Tessa, I need those salads now." Miguel's voice cut through the kitchen noise, sharp with urgency but not cruel. "The hot items are ready. We can't hold them." Tessa's hand shook as she plated faster, but faster meant sloppier. She forgot to add candied pecans to a salad that required them. She grabbed the wrong dressing bottle and had to scrape it off and redo the entire thing. Around her, the other cooks moved with practiced efficiency, sautéing, grilling, plating, while she struggled with the simplest station on the line. "Reset," Miguel said, appearing at her shoulder during a brief lull between waves of orders. "Stop trying to go fast. Fast comes with practice. Right now, focus on accurate. Build each salad exactly right, even if it takes longer. Speed without accuracy is just creating more problems." Tessa nodded, blinking back tears of frustration. She'd spent 3 weeks telling these people they weren't efficient enough, and now she couldn't even build a salad fast enough to keep pace with dinner service. The next wave hit, and Tessa forced herself to slow down, to focus on accuracy over speed. The tickets piled up, and she could feel the tension in the kitchen rising as her station became the bottleneck, but Miguel's words echoed in her head. Accurate first, then fast. Do it right, even if doing it right takes longer. Slowly, painfully, she began to find a rhythm. Read the ticket, visualize the salad, build it step by step, dress it, plate it, send it to the pass. The speed came incrementally, building on the foundation of accuracy rather than trying to rush and creating mistakes that cost even more time. By the end of service, Tessa was drenched in sweat despite working the cold station. Her hands cramped from gripping tongs for 3 hours straight. Her feet felt like they might fall off. But she'd made it through dinner service without completely collapsing the line, and that felt like a victory. "Better," Miguel said as they broke down the stations after the last customer had left. "Still slow, but better. Tomorrow night you'll be faster. The night after that, faster still. It takes time." "How long did it take you to get fast?" Tessa asked, scrubbing the salad station's cutting board. Miguel smiled slightly. "About 6 months before I stopped being the slowest person on the line, but I was 18 and had never worked in a real kitchen before. You have the advantage of understanding what you're supposed to be doing. You just need your hands to catch up with your brain." He paused in his cleaning, looking at her directly. "Can I tell you something, though? What you're learning right now, this is what you should have learned before you started making decisions about our schedules and our systems. When you cut our hours by 17%, you didn't understand that we were already running lean. We weren't being inefficient, we were being thorough. Every minute we spent here mattered because we knew what happened when corners got cut." Tessa stopped scrubbing, meeting his eyes. "I know, I'm sorry." "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad," Miguel said, returning to his own cleaning. "I'm telling you because I want you to understand why everyone was so angry. It wasn't about you personally. It was about watching someone who didn't understand the work telling us we weren't working hard enough. That hurts in a way that's hard to explain." The words settled on Tessa like a weight. She thought about the staffing spreadsheet she'd created in her second week, the careful calculations that had shown 17% overstaffing based on industry standards. She'd been so proud of that analysis, so certain she was solving a problem. But those industry standards didn't account for the kind of restaurant Harbor Street was. A place where every dish was made from scratch, where quality mattered more than speed, where the staff took pride in doing things right, even when right took longer. "I wish someone had told me," Tessa said quietly. "I wish someone had explained." "We tried," Miguel replied, his voice gentle but firm. "That first staff meeting when you outlined your efficiency plan, Carolyn asked if you'd reviewed the current workload. You said you'd analyzed the numbers, and the numbers didn't lie. When I mentioned that we were already barely keeping up during rush periods, you said that was because we needed better time management systems." Tessa remembered that meeting. She remembered feeling impatient with their questions, interpreting their concerns as resistance to change rather than as genuine warnings from people who understood the reality of the work. "We stopped trying to tell you after that," Miguel continued, "because it was clear you weren't interested in hearing it. You'd already decided what was wrong and how to fix it. Nothing we said was going to change your mind. So you told Evan." "So we told Evan," Miguel confirmed. And he kept saying to give you time, that maybe you'd figure it out. He believed in you longer than any of us did. That night, driving home in her ruined clothes with her aching body and her bruised ego, Tessa found herself thinking about belief. Evan had believed she could learn. Miguel had bet against her. Marcus had hoped Miguel was right. And Tessa herself hadn't known what she believed until she'd been forced to actually do the work she'd been so confidently criticizing. The second week brought new challenges. Tessa rotated through different line positions: garde-manger, sauté, grill. Each station had its own demands, its own timing, its own skill requirements. The sauté station taught her about heat control and multitasking, about managing 4 pans simultaneously while keeping track of multiple tickets. The grill station taught her about patience, about knowing when meat was properly cooked not by timers but by touch and experience. Every station taught her humility. She burned herself more times than she could count. The inside of her forearms developed a collection of small red marks from brushing against hot pan handles. She learned to work through the pain, to run cool water over a burn for 30 seconds, and then get back to the station because service didn't stop for injuries unless they required an emergency room. "You're doing better," Carolyn said one afternoon during the lull between lunch and dinner. Tessa had been helping reset tables in the dining room, learning the front-of-house systems she'd never bothered to fully understand. "I can see you trying. That matters." "Does it?" Tessa asked. "Does it matter when I spent 3 weeks undoing things you'd spent years building?" Carolyn set down the napkins she'd been folding and looked at Tessa directly. "Do you know what this restaurant meant to us after Rebecca died? Do you have any idea what it was like watching Evan try to hold everything together?" Tessa shook her head. "He was drowning," Carolyn said, her voice soft with remembered pain. Grief and medical bills and funeral expenses, and a 7-year-old who didn't understand why his mother wasn't coming back. Evan showed up to work every day because he had to, because he had a son to support and bills to pay, but you could see he was barely holding on. And we, all of us, we rallied around him. Not because we had to, but because this place had become family. She picked up another napkin, folding it with practiced efficiency. When Evan had to step back from management, when he had to take on extra work just to survive, we could have left. We could have found jobs at places that paid better or had easier schedules, but we stayed because we understood what this restaurant was. It was the life raft that was keeping Evan afloat. If we let it sink, he'd sink with it. Tessa felt her throat tighten. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Carolyn corrected gently. "That's what hurt the most about these last few weeks. You came in with all these plans to fix us, to make us more efficient, to modernize us. But you never once asked what we were trying to accomplish or why we did things the way we did them. You just assumed we were doing it wrong." "I was wrong," Tessa said, "about everything." "Maybe," Carolyn agreed. "But you're here now, doing the work, learning what you should have learned first. That counts for something." She paused, then added, "Just don't expect us to forget what happened overnight. Trust is rebuilt slowly, in small moments, through consistent actions. You have a long way to go." The honesty was both painful and refreshing. Tessa had grown accustomed to corporate environments where everyone performed politeness even when they were undermining each other. Here, people said what they meant. They were kind, but they were truthful. And somehow, that truth was more valuable than any amount of false encouragement would have been. By the third week, something shifted in how the staff interacted with Tessa. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a tentative acceptance. She'd proven she wouldn't quit. She'd shown up every morning at 6 a.m., worked until her body gave out, and come back the next day to do it again. That persistence had earned her a small measure of credibility. Marcus started offering unsolicited advice on knife techniques. Ray showed her shortcuts for organizing the dish pit that made the work slightly less overwhelming. Even Miguel occasionally smiled at her jokes during the morning prep sessions. But the real breakthrough came during her 4th week, on a Wednesday evening when everything went wrong. The dinner rush was in full swing, the kitchen operating at maximum capacity. Tessa was back at the salad station, finally comfortable enough with the position to keep pace with the rest of the line. Miguel was running the pass, calling out orders and ensuring every plate met his standards before it went to the dining room. Then the refrigeration unit for the cold storage failed. Miguel discovered it when he went to grab backup ingredients during a brief lull between order waves. The temperature had risen into the danger zone. Everything inside would have to be thrown out. They just lost their backup supplies of proteins, dairy, and vegetables in the middle of one of their busiest nights of the week. "Everyone listen up," Miguel called out, his voice tight with controlled stress. "The cold storage is down. We're running on what we have at our stations and whatever's in the walk-in. That means we're 86ing about half the menu until we can get backup supplies. Carolyn, you need to tell the front of house now." Carolyn appeared in the kitchen doorway, took in Miguel's expression, and immediately understood the severity of the situation. "What do we still have?" Miguel ran through the list rapidly, his mind already calculating what dishes were still possible with limited ingredients. As he talked, Tessa found herself doing something she hadn't done since her demotion. She started thinking systemically about the problem. "What about the prep in the walk-in?" she asked. "The vegetables I helped Marcus prep this morning, those are still good, right?" "Yes, but we don't have enough for full menu service," Miguel replied. "We prepped for our normal volume, not for having to recreate half our station backups." "What if we modified the menu instead of eliminating dishes?" Tessa suggested, the old management part of her brain engaging despite her better judgment. "Keep the popular items, but simplify the components. The grilled salmon doesn't need the asparagus side. We could substitute the roasted root vegetables from prep. The pasta primavera could become pasta marinara since we still have the tomato base." Miguel paused, considering. That could work for some dishes, but we'd need to recalculate portions and timing. "I can do that," Tessa offered. "If you tell me what dishes you want to modify, I can work out the portions and write up simplified prep instructions while you keep the line running." For a moment, Miguel hesitated, and Tessa could see him weighing whether to trust her with something this important. Then he nodded. "Okay, but run everything past me before we implement it. No changes go out without my approval." For the next 2 hours, Tessa operated in 2 roles simultaneously. She continued building salads at her station during order waves, but between rushes she worked with Miguel to redesign the evening menu on the fly. She calculated portions, rewrote descriptions, coordinated with Carolyn about how to present the changes to customers. It was the first time since her demotion that she'd been allowed to use her management skills, but now those skills were grounded in an understanding of the actual work required to execute each decision. "We're going to run out of the salad mix in about 45 minutes at this pace," Tessa told Miguel during one assessment. "But if we start using the spring mix from the walk-in and add extra cherry tomatoes to bulk it up, we can stretch our supply through the rest of the night." "Do it," Miguel agreed. "And let me know if you see any other bottlenecks developing." The evening became a masterclass in adaptive problem solving. Every 15 minutes brought a new challenge: running low on a key ingredient, timing issues with modified dishes, coordination problems between the kitchen and front of house. But the staff worked together with practiced efficiency, each person doing their part to keep service running despite the crisis. And Tessa, for the first time since she'd arrived at Harbor Street Bistro, felt like she was actually contributing something valuable. Not imposing systems from above, but working alongside everyone else to solve problems as they emerged. Not directing, but collaborating. Not managing, but serving. By the time the last order went out and the kitchen finally began to wind down, everyone was exhausted. Miguel gathered the staff together, his face showing the strain of the evening, but also something that looked like pride. "That was rough," he said, "but we pulled through. Everyone stepped up. Everyone adapted. That's what makes this kitchen work. Not when everything goes perfectly, but when things fall apart and we find a way anyway." He looked at Tessa. "Good work tonight. You saw the problems before they became disasters, and you helped us stay ahead of them. That's what we need from leadership. Not someone telling us how to do our jobs, but someone who understands the work well enough to support us when things get complicated." The words were the first real praise Tessa had received since her demotion, and they hit harder than any performance review she'd ever gotten in her previous career. Because this praise was earned through actual contribution, through proving herself in the moment when it mattered most. After everyone else had left, Tessa stayed behind to help finish the deep clean of the kitchen. Evan appeared from the office where he'd been doing paperwork, surveying the cleaned kitchen with satisfaction. "Miguel told me about tonight," Evan said, "about how you helped manage the crisis." "I just did what needed to be done," Tessa replied, wringing out the mop for the final time. "That's exactly right," Evan agreed. "You did what needed to be done, not what you thought should be done, or what your training told you should be done. You looked at the situation, used your skills to help solve the problem, and you did it without needing to be in charge. Do you understand the difference? Tessa leaned on the mop handle, considering. I think so. Before, I was so focused on implementing my vision that I couldn't see what was actually happening. Tonight, I was focused on supporting what was already working and helping fix what wasn't. I was serving the kitchen instead of trying to control it. Exactly, Evan said. That's what leadership actually is. Serving the people doing the work, not directing them. Understanding their challenges, anticipating their needs, removing obstacles that get in their way. You can't do that from an office with spreadsheets. You can only do it by actually knowing what the work requires. He moved to the prep station where Tessa had spent so many hours learning to cut vegetables with increasing competence. You know what Rebecca used to tell me about teaching? She said you can't teach people what they're not ready to learn. You can tell them. You can lecture them. You can give them all the information they need. But until they're ready to actually receive it, until they've had the experiences that make that information meaningful, it just bounces off. I wasn't ready, Tessa said quietly. 3 weeks ago. If you'd told me everything I know now, I wouldn't have believed it. I would have thought you were making excuses or being sentimental or just resistant to change. Probably, Evan agreed without judgment. That's why I had to let you fail. That's why I let you make your changes and call your meetings and implement your systems even though I knew they were going to cause problems. Because sometimes the only way to learn something is to crash into it hard enough that you can't ignore it anymore. Tessa thought about that night in the kitchen, about Liam's terrified face and the cold metal of handcuffs, and the moment when all her certainty had shattered. That's a harsh way to teach someone. Life is harsh, Evan replied, and restaurant work is unforgiving. You can't fake it. You can't pretend. The work either gets done right or it doesn't, and there are immediate consequences when it doesn't. That's why this is such a good training ground for learning what leadership actually means, because the feedback is instant and undeniable. He picked up his jacket, preparing to leave for the night. You're halfway through your 60 days, Tessa. You've learned a lot, but the harder part is still coming. What do you mean? You've learned to do the work, Evan explained. Now you need to learn how to lead people who are doing the work. And that's much more difficult because it requires you to balance competing needs. Efficiency and compassion, standards and understanding, accountability and grace. It requires wisdom, not just knowledge. I don't know if I have that, Tessa admitted. Neither did I when Rebecca died, Evan said. I was just trying to survive. But I learned it the same way you're learning everything else. By showing up every day and trying to do slightly better than I did the day before. By failing, learning from the failure, and trying again. He paused at the door. Next week, you're moving to front of house. You'll be working directly with customers, handling complaints, managing the dining room flow. It's going to test you in different ways than the kitchen has. People skills versus technical skills. Emotional regulation instead of physical endurance. Are you ready? Tessa thought about it honestly. Probably not, but I'm willing to try. That's all anyone can ask, Evan said, and then he was gone, leaving Tessa alone in the quiet kitchen. She finished putting away the mop and took one last look around the space that had taught her so much over the past month. Every station held memories of small failures and incremental successes. The dish pit where she'd learned humility, the prep station where she'd learned patience, the line where she'd learned coordination and timing and the value of accuracy over speed. And tonight, the moment when everything had fallen apart and she'd finally understood what it meant to lead by serving rather than controlling. Tessa turned off the lights and walked out to her car, her body tired in a way that felt earned rather than depleted. Her hands still bore the marks of 4 weeks of hard labor, the calluses and small scars that told the story of her education. Her clothes were permanently ruined, her manicure was a distant memory, and her back probably would never be the same. But something else had changed too. Something in the way she saw herself and the world around her. She'd arrived at Harbor Street Bistro, certain she knew how to fix what was broken. She'd discovered that what was broken was her own understanding, and the fix required breaking herself down and rebuilding from scratch. That night, Tessa slept deeply and dreamlessly, her body and mind both exhausted in the best possible way. And when her alarm went off at 5 a.m. the next morning, she didn't hesitate or question or resist. She simply got up, got dressed, and drove back to the restaurant to do it all again. Because that's what the work required. That's what she'd finally learned to value. Not the appearance of leadership, but the substance of it. Not the authority of a title, but the credibility of experience. Not the certainty of having all the answers, but the humility of knowing there was always more to learn. And as she pulled into the parking lot at Harbor Street Bistro, Tessa realized something that would have seemed impossible just 4 weeks ago. She was grateful. Grateful for the failure that had forced her to learn. Grateful for the people who'd been patient enough to teach her. Grateful for the work itself, with all its difficulty and demand and unforgiving honesty. She was grateful for the chance to become better than she had been. Inside, Evan was already there with 2 cups of coffee, ready to start another day. And Tessa walked through the door with her head held high, ready to learn whatever lesson today would teach. The transition to front of house came during her 5th week, and Tessa discovered that working with customers required an entirely different skill set than working in the kitchen. In the kitchen, the work was tangible and immediate. You either made the dish correctly or you didn't. But in the dining room, everything existed in shades of gray, in managing expectations and reading emotions and navigating the complex dance between what customers wanted and what was actually possible. Carolyn paired Tessa with herself for the first few shifts, demonstrating the careful choreography of good service. "Watch how I approach tables," Carolyn instructed as the lunch rush began. "You're reading body language before you even speak. Are they in a hurry? Are they celebrating something? Are they having an argument and just want to be left alone? Every table is different, and you have to adjust your approach accordingly." Tessa watched as Carolyn moved through the dining room with practiced grace, somehow knowing exactly when to check on a table and when to give them space, when to make recommendations and when to simply take the order efficiently. It looked effortless, but Tessa was beginning to understand that anything that looked effortless was actually the result of years of practice and attention. Her first solo table was a couple celebrating an anniversary. Tessa approached with what she hoped was friendly confidence, but she could feel herself overcompensating, talking too much, trying too hard. When she returned to the kitchen to place their order, Carolyn was waiting with a gentle correction. "You're performing for them instead of serving them," Carolyn said. "They don't need entertainment. They need someone who's competent and unobtrusive. Someone who makes their evening easier, not someone who becomes part of it. Do you see the difference?" Tessa nodded, thinking about how often in her previous career she'd confused presence with value, visibility with contribution. "It's like the kitchen crisis last week. I helped by supporting what was already working, not by making it about me." "Exactly," Carolyn confirmed. "Good service is invisible until something goes wrong. Your job is to anticipate needs before they become requests, to solve problems before they become complaints. You're not the main event, they are. You're just making sure everything flows smoothly for them." Over the following days, Tessa learned the rhythm of front-of-house work. She learned how to carry multiple plates without looking awkward, how to remember orders without writing everything down, how to handle the delicate moment when something wasn't quite right with a dish and a customer needed accommodation. Each interaction taught her something about reading people, about communication, about the difference between hearing what someone said and understanding what they meant. But the real test came on a Friday evening during her 6th week, when a customer became verbally abusive over a relatively minor mistake. Tessa had brought the wrong side dish with an entree, roasted vegetables instead of the mashed potatoes that had been ordered. It was a simple mistake, easily corrected, and she'd apologized immediately and offered to bring the correct dish right away. But the customer, a middle-aged man who'd already had several drinks, escalated dramatically. "This is completely unacceptable, Tessa," he said loudly enough that nearby tables turned to look. "I've been coming to this restaurant for years, and the service has gone completely downhill. Are you new? You must be new because anyone competent would know how to take a simple order." Tessa felt her face flush with embarrassment and rising anger. Her instinct, the old Tessa instinct, was to defend herself, to explain that it was the kitchen's error in reading the ticket, not hers. But she stopped herself, thinking about everything she'd learned over the past 6 weeks. This wasn't about being right. This was about making the situation better. "You're absolutely right, sir, and I apologize," Tessa said, keeping her voice calm and professional. "Let me get you the mashed potatoes right away,
and I'll make sure the manager knows about this issue." "I want to speak to the manager now," the man demanded, "not after you've had time to spin some story about what happened." Tessa glanced toward the kitchen, where she could see Evan through the pass window. He was watching the interaction, his expression unreadable. This was a test, she realized. He could intervene at any moment, but he was waiting to see how she would handle it. "Of course," Tessa said to the customer. "I'll get him immediately." She walked to the kitchen, her heart pounding. Miguel looked up from the line with concern. "That guy giving you trouble?" "Nothing I can't handle," Tessa said, then caught herself. "Actually, I don't know if I can handle it, but I'm going to try." Evan wiped his hands on a towel and headed toward the dining room, and Tessa followed. But before they reached the customer's table, Evan turned to her. "What do you think needs to happen here?" he asked quietly. "He's angry and embarrassed because he made a scene," Tessa analyzed. "At this point, it's not really about the potatoes anymore. It's about him feeling validated and not looking foolish in front of the other customers. So we need to give him a way to save face while also resolving the actual problem." Evan nodded slowly. "And how would you do that?" "Comp his entree," Tessa said immediately. "Apologize sincerely, take responsibility without making excuses, and make sure he leaves feeling like he won. Because ultimately his satisfaction matters more than being right about whose fault it was. Even though it costs us the price of an entree?" "Even though," Tessa confirmed, "because the cost of him leaving angry and telling everyone he knows that Harbor Street has terrible service would be much higher than the cost of one meal." Something shifted in Evan's expression, a flash of approval that was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Then handle it. I'll back you up if you need me, but try to resolve it yourself first." Tessa returned to the table, her hands steady despite her nervousness. The man looked ready to launch into another tirade, but Tessa spoke first. "Sir, I've spoken with our owner about what happened, and we want to make this right. First, your entree tonight is completely on us. No charge. Second, I'm having the kitchen prepare your side exactly as you ordered it. And third, I want you to know that I take full responsibility for this mistake. You deserve better service than what I provided tonight, and I'm truly sorry." The man's expression shifted, the wind taken out of his sails by the complete capitulation. "Well, it wasn't all your fault, I suppose. The kitchen should have gotten it right." "They usually do," Tessa said honestly. "We have an excellent kitchen staff. Tonight was an exception, and I should have caught the error before it reached your table. Is there anything else I can do to improve your evening?" The man seemed mollified, the righteous anger draining away now that he'd gotten what he wanted. "No, that's fine. Thank you for handling it professionally." Tessa returned to the kitchen on shaking legs, aware that multiple tables had witnessed the entire exchange. Carolyn intercepted her before she could disappear into the dish pit to hide. "That was well done," Carolyn said quietly. "You de-escalated instead of defending. You gave him what he needed emotionally, not just what he demanded practically. That's advanced-level service." "I just did what seemed right," Tessa said, though her heart was still racing. "That's exactly the point," Carolyn replied. 6 weeks ago, you would have tried to prove you were right and he was overreacting. You would have made it worse because you couldn't separate your ego from the situation. But now you understand that good service isn't about ego, it's about outcomes. That incident became a turning point in how the staff viewed Tessa. Word spread quickly through the restaurant about how she'd handled the difficult customer, and she noticed a subtle shift in people's interactions with her. Marcus started saving her a seat during the family meals that had resumed after Tessa's policies were reversed. Ray asked her opinion about reorganizing the dish pit for better efficiency. Miguel invited her to help plan the menu for an upcoming special event. She was being invited back into the community she'd almost destroyed. But the real moment of transformation came during her 8th week, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Liam came to the restaurant after school, his backpack covered in those same superhero patches, his light-up sneakers tracking mud into the kitchen until Evan made him take them off at the door. "Dad, I got an A on my history test," Liam announced, waving a paper proudly. Evan scooped him up despite the fact that the boy was getting too big to be carried. "That's my guy! I'm so proud of you!" Tessa watched the interaction from the prep station where she was helping Marcus with the dinner mise en place. She'd seen Liam around the restaurant over the past 2 months.
doing homework at the corner table, helping Ray organize clean dishes, chattering with Carolyn about his soccer games. But she'd kept her distance, unsure how to interact with the child who'd watched his father get handcuffed because of her false accusation. Liam noticed her watching and whispered something to his dad. Evan set him down, and the boy approached Tessa with the fearless curiosity of 7-year-olds. "You're Tessa, right?" Liam asked. "The lady who called the police on my dad?" Tessa's throat went tight. "Yes, I am, and I'm very, very sorry about that, Liam. I made a mistake, a big mistake, and I hurt your dad and I scared you, and that was wrong." Liam considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important matters. "My dad said you're learning how to be better. Are you?" "I'm trying," Tessa said honestly. "Your dad has been teaching me a lot of things I didn't understand before."
Like what?
"Like how to wash dishes properly," Tessa replied, which made Liam giggle. "And how to cut vegetables without cutting my fingers. And how to treat people with respect even when I think I know better than they do." "That's important," Liam said gravely. "My mom used to say that everyone has something to teach you if you're willing to learn from them, even kids." The casual mention of Rebecca made the kitchen go still. Evan had stopped what he was doing, watching his son with an expression of such tender grief that it made Tessa's chest ache. "Your mom sounds like she was a very wise person," Tessa said softly. "She was the best," Liam agreed. Then, with the mercurial mood shifts of childhood, he brightened. "Hey, do you want to see my history test? I got all the dates right about the Revolutionary War." "I'd love to see it," Tessa said, and meant it. Liam ran to get his backpack, and Evan approached Tessa, his voice low. "Thank you for apologizing to him." "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Tessa replied. "He was there. He saw everything. He deserved to hear me take responsibility." Evan nodded, and in that nod was a depth of approval that meant more to Tessa than any performance evaluation she'd ever received, because this approval wasn't about her skills or her efficiency or her productivity. It was about her character and whether she'd learned to value the right things. Over the following weeks, Tessa developed an unlikely friendship with Liam. He'd show her his schoolwork while she prepped vegetables. She'd help him with his math homework during the lull between lunch and dinner. He taught her the names of all the superheroes on his backpack, and she taught him how to properly set a table for fine dining. Their interactions were easy and uncomplicated in the way that friendships with children can be. He'd forgiven her completely because children are better at forgiveness than adults, and she treasured that forgiveness as the gift it was. As Tessa entered her 9th week, Evan began involving her in management decisions again. But the dynamic was completely different now. Instead of presenting her plans and expecting compliance, she found herself in genuine conversations about how the restaurant operated and what might be improved. "I've been thinking about the prep schedule," Tessa said during one of their early morning coffee sessions. "Not because it's inefficient, I understand now why it works the way it does, but because I noticed Marcus is doing a lot of redundant work. He's prepping vegetables in the morning, and then Miguel is doing additional prep in the afternoon for dinner service. What if we staggered the shifts differently so that prep work flowed more naturally from lunch to dinner?" "Show me what you're thinking," Evan said, and they spent the next hour working through possibilities, with Evan explaining the constraints Tessa hadn't considered, and Tessa offering solutions to problems Evan had accepted as inevitable. It was collaboration, not direction, partnership, not management, and it worked in ways that Tessa's original efficiency improvements never had, because it was grounded in understanding rather than assumption. "This is good," Evan said, reviewing their final plan. "Let's test it for 2 weeks and see if it actually reduces redundancy without creating new problems. Miguel needs to sign off on it, and Marcus should weigh in since it affects his schedule most directly." "Of course," Tessa agreed. "I'll present it to them and get their feedback before we implement anything." Evan smiled slightly. 2 months ago, you would have just changed the schedule and expected everyone to adapt." 2 months ago, I was an idiot," Tessa replied. "Not an idiot," Evan corrected. "Just someone who hadn't learned the difference between management and leadership. Management is about systems and processes. Leadership is about people and relationships. You needed to learn to be a good manager by first learning to be a good follower." The 60th day arrived with startling speed. Tessa had rotated through every position, worked every shift type, handled every crisis that had emerged during her 2-month education. Her hands bore permanent calluses. Her back had adapted to long hours of standing. Her feet no longer screamed at the end of a shift. But more importantly, her understanding of what made Harbor Street Bistro work had been completely rebuilt from the ground up. Evan called a staff meeting for the end of the day, and Tessa felt her stomach twist with nervousness. This was it, the moment when Evan would decide whether she'd actually learned anything or whether the past 60 days had been a waste of everyone's time. The entire staff gathered in the dining room after the restaurant closed. Miguel, Marcus, Ray, Carolyn, and the other servers and kitchen staff who'd watched Tessa's transformation over the past 2 months. Even Liam was there, sitting on the counter and swinging his legs while eating a cookie that Carolyn had given him. "So," Evan began, leaning against one of the tables, "it's been 60 days since Tessa started her crash course in restaurant operations, and I think we need to talk about what happens next." The room was silent, everyone waiting. "Tessa," Evan continued, "you came here with impressive credentials and complete confidence that you knew how to fix what was wrong with this place. You spent 3 weeks implementing changes that nearly broke us, and then you called the police on me in front of my son because you were so certain you were right that you couldn't see the truth in front of you." Tessa felt her face burn with shame, even though she'd long since accepted responsibility for all of it. "But then," Evan went on, "you did something that I didn't expect. You stayed. You worked. You learned. You let yourself be broken down so you could be built back up with a better foundation. And that took a kind of courage that I respect deeply." He straightened, looking at each staff member in turn. "I asked all of you to give Tessa a chance to prove she could learn. Some of you were skeptical. Miguel, I know you bet against her lasting a week. Marcus, you told me you'd believe it when you saw it. And that was fair because Tessa had given you no reason to believe in her. But she showed up every day," Carolyn interjected. "Even when she was exhausted and hurting and probably wanted to quit, she showed up." "She helped us through the refrigeration crisis," Miguel added. "She saw problems we'd missed and helped us adapt instead of panicking." "She apologized to my kid," Evan said, his voice softening. "She took responsibility, not just to me but to Liam, who deserved to hear it. That mattered." He turned back to Tessa. "So here's what I've decided. There's still a general manager position open at Harbor Street Bistro, but it's not the same position you thought you were taking 2 months ago. This position requires someone who understands every role in this restaurant because they've done it themselves. Someone who can prep vegetables and wash dishes and handle customer complaints and redesign systems when needed. Someone who leads by serving, not by controlling." Tessa held her breath. "Tessa, if you want it, the job is yours. But you need to understand what you're agreeing to. You'll be managing people who know more than you do about their specific jobs. Your role isn't to tell them how to do their work. It's to support them in doing it well, to remove obstacles, to advocate for them, to make sure this restaurant remains a place where people take pride in what they do because they're treated with dignity and respect." "I understand," Tessa said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning in her chest. "And I want it. Not because I think I've learned everything I know I haven't, but because I finally understand what I'm supposed to be learning, and I want to keep getting better at it." Evan looked around the room. "Does anyone object to Tessa becoming general manager?" There was a long moment of silence, and Tessa felt the weight of 2 months of hard work hanging in the balance. Then Miguel spoke. "No objection. She's earned it." "Agreed," Carolyn said. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, she's okay." Ray gave a thumbs up from where he stood in the doorway to the kitchen. "Then it's settled," Evan said. "Tessa, welcome back to management. Try not to call the police on me again." The tension broke with laughter, and Tessa felt tears burning behind her eyes. Not tears of relief exactly, but something deeper. Gratitude for the chance she'd been given, respect for the people who'd been patient enough to teach her, and joy at being welcomed back into a community she'd almost destroyed. Over the following months, Tessa settled into her new role with a completely different approach than her first attempt. She created systems, yes, but she created them in collaboration with the people who would actually use them. She improved efficiency, but she measured that efficiency in terms of quality of work life, not just productivity metrics. She made changes, but she made them slowly. with buy-in from everyone affected. The restaurant thrived, not because of dramatic innovations or revolutionary changes, but because everyone working there felt valued and supported. Staff turnover, which had been starting to creep up during Tessa's first 3 weeks, dropped to nearly zero. The quality of service improved because people took pride in their work rather than just following procedures. And customers noticed the difference. They could feel the warmth in the space, the genuine care that went into every interaction. One evening, about 6 months after her reinstatement, Tessa was working the floor during dinner service when she noticed an older woman sitting alone at a corner table. The woman had ordered the chicken special, but was now staring at it with an expression of such profound sadness that Tessa stopped what she was doing and approached gently. "Is everything all right with your meal?" Tessa asked softly. The woman looked up, her eyes wet with tears. "The food is perfect. It's just my husband and I used to come here every month for our anniversary dinner. He passed away 3 months ago, and I thought I could handle coming alone, but—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Tessa could have offered to box the meal, could have brought the check quickly to end the woman's discomfort. That would have been efficient, but she'd learned that efficiency wasn't always the right goal. Instead, Tessa pulled out the chair across from the woman and sat down. "Would you like to tell me about him?" The woman's face crumpled with gratitude, and for the next 20 minutes, Tessa listened as she shared stories about her late husband, their first date, their wedding, their 53 years together. She listened without rushing, without checking her watch, without thinking about the other tables that needed attention. She just listened because that was what this moment required. When the woman finally finished her meal and prepared to leave, she squeezed Tessa's hand. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Tessa replied. "This is what we're here for, not just to serve food, but to take care of people." She watched the woman leave, feeling the weight of that interaction settle into her understanding of what her job actually was. This was what Evan had been trying to teach her. This was what the past 6 months had been about. Not systems or efficiency or productivity, but the fundamental truth that everything, absolutely everything, came down to how you treated people. Evan had been watching from the kitchen window, and when Tessa returned to check on the other tables, he caught her eye and nodded with approval that needed no words. Later that evening, after the restaurant had closed and the staff had finished cleaning, Tessa found herself alone with Evan in the quiet kitchen. They were doing the final check of the stations, making sure everything was ready for the next day's opening. "Can I ask you something?" Tessa said as she wiped down the prep counter. "That first night when I called the police, you could have told me who you were at any point. You could have stopped it before it got that far. Why didn't you?" Evan was quiet for a moment, organizing the dry storage with the methodical care he brought to everything. "Do you remember what I told you about Rebecca's student? The one who learned kindness by being given responsibility for it?" "Yes." "I was that kid," Evan said. "Not literally, but that story was about me. When I was 14, I was angry at the world. My dad had left, my mom was working 3 jobs, and I was taking that anger out on everyone around me. I was heading towards serious trouble." He closed the storage cabinet and turned to face her. "Then I met a teacher, Mr. Harrison, 11th grade English, who saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. He didn't punish me or lecture me or try to control my anger. Instead, he gave me responsibility. He made me his teaching assistant, put me in charge of helping younger students who were struggling. And something about being responsible for others, about having people depend on me, changed everything." Tessa listened, understanding beginning to dawn. "That night when you called the police, I could have stopped it," Evan continued. "I could have revealed who I was and made you look foolish. But I realized that you were like me at 14, so certain you were right, so focused on your own perspective that you couldn't see anything else. And the only way you were going to learn was by crashing into the consequences of that certainty hard enough that you couldn't ignore them anymore. That's why you gave me responsibility instead of just firing me," Tessa said. "You made me responsible for understanding the people I'd hurt." "Exactly," Evan confirmed. "I gave you the chance to become better by making you accountable for what better actually looked like. And you surprised me. You took that chance seriously. You did the work, even when it was hard and humiliating and everything in you probably wanted to quit." "I almost did quit," Tessa admitted. "About a dozen times, actually. The only thing that kept me coming back was the fact that you believed I could learn, and I didn't want to prove you wrong." "Rebecca would have liked you," Evan said quietly. "She always believed that people could change if you gave them the right reasons and the right support. She would have said that what happened that night with the police wasn't a mistake. It was necessary. Because sometimes we need to be broken before we can be remade into something better." They finished the closing routine in comfortable silence, and Tessa realized that this quiet partnership in making sure everything was ready for tomorrow was what leadership actually looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but showing up consistently, taking care of the details, making sure the people depending on you had what they needed to do their jobs well. As they prepared to leave, Liam burst through from the office where he'd been doing homework. "Dad, I finished. Can we go get ice cream?" "It's 9 o'clock, buddy. That's pretty late for ice cream." "But we haven't gone in forever," Liam pleaded. Then he turned to Tessa. "You should come too. Dad always gets boring vanilla, but I get chocolate peanut butter, and it's way better." Tessa glanced at Evan, unsure if the invitation was genuine or just childish enthusiasm. But Evan was smiling, a real smile, open and warm, and he nodded. "Come on, we can spare 20 minutes for ice cream." So Tessa found herself in a booth at the ice cream shop down the street, listening to Liam chatter about his upcoming soccer game while Evan ate his boring vanilla, and she tried the chocolate peanut butter that Liam insisted was superior. And somewhere in that ordinary moment, in the laughter and the ice cream and the easy companionship, Tessa realized that she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. She'd found a community, a family, built not on blood or obligation, but on shared experience and mutual respect and the willingness to show up for each other consistently, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. "What are you smiling about?" Liam asked, noticing her expression. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," Tessa said honestly. "That's good," Liam replied with the wisdom of children. "My mom used to say that when you know you're lucky, you should hold on to it tight and not mess it up." "Smart advice," Tessa agreed. "I'll try to remember that." They finished their ice cream and walked back to the parking lot where their cars waited. Evan loaded Liam into the back seat of his ancient sedan, the boy already half asleep, exhausted from his day. "Thank you," Tessa said to Evan before they parted ways. "For everything. For the chance, for the lessons, for believing I could be better than I was." "Thank you for proving me right," Evan replied. "It doesn't always work out that way, but when it does, it makes everything worth it." He drove off into the night, and Tessa stood in the parking lot for a moment, looking up at the stars and thinking about the journey that had brought her here. From arrogant certainty to crushing failure to hard-won understanding. From thinking she knew everything to discovering she knew nothing to slowly, painfully learning what actually mattered. She thought about the police lights painting the kitchen walls in red and blue, about Liam's terrified face and the cold metal of handcuffs that had never quite closed around Evan's wrists, about the moment when everything she'd believed about herself had shattered, and the long, difficult work of building something better from the pieces. And she thought about tomorrow, when she'd show up at 6 a.m. for the delivery truck, when she'd work alongside people who'd become her friends and her teachers, when she'd continue learning how to lead by serving rather than controlling, how to build systems that supported people rather than constrained them, how to measure success not in productivity metrics, but in the dignity and joy people found in their work. It wouldn't always be easy. There would be new challenges, new mistakes, new lessons to learn. But Tessa finally understood that this was the work, not reaching some final destination of perfection, but showing up every day to try to do slightly better than you did the day before. Harbor Street Bistro had survived tragedy and near collapse. It had endured Tessa's well-intentioned destruction and her subsequent redemption. And it would continue, as all truly good things do, not because it was perfect, but because the people who cared for it showed up consistently, tried earnestly, and treated each other with the dignity that all human beings deserve. In the months and years that followed, the restaurant became known throughout the city not just for its food, but for something harder to define: an atmosphere, a feeling. The sense that walking through its doors meant being welcomed into something larger than a transaction, a community that valued people over profit, quality over speed, relationships over efficiency. Customers noticed it in the way servers genuinely cared about their experience, in the way kitchen staff took pride in every dish, in the way management decisions balanced business needs with human dignity. They noticed it, and they kept coming back, and they told others. And slowly Harbor Street Bistro became something rare and precious, a place where everyone, from the owner to the dishwasher to the customers themselves, felt like they mattered. And at the center of it all stood Evan Cole, who'd lost everything and rebuilt it better, who'd hidden his identity to learn truth, who'd offered second chances when punishment would have been easier, who'd taught through example that the measure of leadership isn't control or authority, but the willingness to serve those you lead with consistency, patience, and grace. Years later, when people asked Tessa about the turning point in her career, about the moment when she transformed from a competent manager into a true leader, she never told them about her MBA or her professional training or her carefully crafted systems. She told them about washing dishes at 6 a.m, about crying over onions and burning her hands and learning to read customers' needs before they expressed them, about a single father who'd lost his wife and nearly lost everything else, but who'd chosen to teach rather than punish, to build rather than destroy, to believe in people's capacity for change, even when all evidence suggested that belief was foolish. She told them about the night she'd called the police on her own boss, and how that catastrophic mistake had become the foundation for everything good that came after. Because sometimes, Tessa learned, the only way to truly understand what matters is to lose sight of it completely. And the only way to become who you're meant to be is to have everything you thought you were broken down and rebuilt from scratch, one lesson at a time, one day at a time, one act of grace at a time. In the end, what Evan had given her wasn't just a job or a second chance. He'd given her a new way of seeing the world, a new way of measuring worth, a new understanding that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions, listening to the answers, and having the humility to admit when you're wrong. And in a quiet kitchen on Harbor Street under warm lights and the steady rhythm of people working together toward a common purpose, Tessa Monroe finally understood what it meant to lead, to serve, and to be part of something larger than herself. The restaurant thrived, the community grew, and everyone who walked through those doors learned, in ways both subtle and profound, that second chances aren't just given. They're earned, lived, and passed forward to others who need them. That was the real ending, not a dramatic revelation or a perfect resolution, but the quiet, persistent work of showing up every day to do better, to be better, to build something worth preserving and to preserve it with dignity, compassion, and grace. And somewhere in heaven, Rebecca Cole smiled, knowing that her husband had learned her lesson well, that people can change when you give them responsibility for something that matters, when you believe in them even when they don't believe in themselves, and when you understand that the point of breaking someone down isn't cruelty. It's giving them the chance to rebuild themselves into something stronger, wiser, and more fully human than they were before.